Hello, and welcome to the Atlantic Debrief, the Atlantic Council Europe Center's internet show and podcast, where we talk about the most important issues facing the transatlantic relationship today. My name is Rachel Rizzo, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. And today I'm thrilled to have with us Nico Lange, senior fellow at the Munich Security Conference and at the Center for European Policy Analysis, SIPA, here in Washington. Nico, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So it has been quite a week quite a couple weeks, actually. And you were on the ground for the week at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And as we know, there have been a lot of discussions on both sides of the Atlantic on what a potential Republican foreign policy might mean for Europe, how Europeans are thinking about it, and sort of just what's on everyone's minds in Europe when it comes to the US elections in November. So first of all, would love to just get your thoughts on how was the RNC? What kind of conversations did you have on the ground, and what were your impressions as you got to and as you left Milwaukee?
Well, I'm a visitor to the US. I mean, I have been living there, but I'm not voting there. I have experience with the election campaign in 2016, and also when I worked in the German government, experience with cooperation with the first Trump government. So in light of this backdrop, it was very interesting to have conversations in Milwaukee, to listen in to what people were saying, maybe also to get some information on who might be relevant for a foreign policy in a possible Trump administration. Get a little bit of a feeling what people think about Ukraine, about transatlantic security, about China. So it was more there to be there to listen and to build contacts. But I was also talking about Ukraine and informing about Ukraine because that's what I'm working on. And to be honest, I had the feeling some people needed to be a little bit better informed.
So what did those conversations look like? Did you leave Milwaukee feeling more confident that a Republican win might mean continued U.S. support for Ukraine, or is that not the message that you got?
Well, first of all, we as Germans, we have an interest in working together with the United States of America, regardless of who will be president. That's for the Americans to decide. Sometimes some fellow Germans in the media, but also in policymaking, they are forgetting about this. And we should not repeat mistakes that were made in 2016 or 2017 when it comes to this. It's very difficult even now, after all the conversations, for me to understand what, for example, a Ukraine policy of a Trump administration could look like. You hear a wide variety of voices, and you have important people such as, for example, Speaker Johnson arguing now in favor of lifting all restrictions for the weapons that were delivered by the US. And you have others there saying, look, Ukraine has to be given up. We have to leave it all to Russia. We should stay out of this. So it's difficult to say at the moment what the policy will be, but we all understand from our own experience, but also from previous transitions in the US, it's one thing to say something at a convention or in the media or on the campaign trail. It's another thing to think about it when you are responsible for a solution and when you are briefed on the matter in detail. So I have more contacts now, I have some more insights, but I still do not know what a Trump government would do with regard to Ukraine or the transatlantic relationship.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like no matter who comes out the victor in November, it's a little bit up in the air because of the partisan nature of Ukraine on Capitol Hill nowadays. At first it wasn't, and as time has gone on, it's turned into this partisan issue, which of course makes it difficult for both Europe and Ukraine, of course, to continue the fight. A lot of
partisan, Rachel, it's partisan, but also paradoxical in some way, because I mean, it has been important Republican senators pushing the White House on some issues regarding Ukraine, and at the same time, There are parts of the Republican leadership that have a totally different position on this. So it's difficult to form a clear picture on this one.
Did you get a sense of how the conversations look when it comes to the NATO alliance? I mean, you were just in Washington for NATO's 75th anniversary summit. It was a big one. I think some people hoped that NATO would be able to go further on Ukraine, but they still came out with some really important decisions, I think, on that front. But there was also this unease that you could feel at the NATO summit because of the election and because of maybe the potential for a Trump administration not to pull the United States out of NATO, because I think he's made it clear that he doesn't really make anything clear, but has said that won't happen. But there's still a sense that the U.S. might be less committed to Europe and NATO. Are those reflective of the conversations that you had on the ground?
Yes, but to be honest with you, I always was on the side of the American argument here, because I believe it's a legitimate question. Why should the American taxpayer permanently pay more for European security than the Europeans themselves? And it's, for me, a big failure of European policymakers that even now, after Trump won and the Biden years, and the possibility of another Biden president, another now Harris presidency, we will come to that, and maybe a second Trump presidency, that the Europeans were not able to really deliver on the 2% spending on defense, on their own capabilities, on industrial capabilities, technological capabilities in Europe. This was all clear years ago, but somehow the Europeans are dragging this out, and it's very difficult to make the argument for transatlantic partnership if there is this weak spot on the European side with the spending not being clear and with the capabilities not being there. Some elements, I think, have improved, and it's sometimes also necessary to bring them across in the communication here in the US, because, for example, many people did not know that Germany is permanently posting a battle-ready brigade to Lithuania, and that Germany is ready to have intermediate range cruise missiles as part of the posture now in Germany. So there are developments, I think, that need also information updates in the US. And that includes the solidarity with Ukraine, because if you count everything together, military aid, financial aid, humanitarian aid, I think the Europeans are sharing the burden with the US, but somehow this is not always perceived in the US.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like the messaging has gotten across, but it doesn't seem like it's being heard, or it's being sort of willfully misinterpreted on our side.
If I may, what I found disagreement, or where I have a fundamental disagreement, is that in GOP circles, you very often meet the notion that the European theater and the Indo-Pacific theater are separated from one another. And there is this argument, the Europeans should take care of Europe so that the US can take care of the Indo-Pacific. But what I experience in Ukraine, and also in Europe-Russia relations, but also in Europe relations with China, seems to me for the Chinese, they look at the Indo-Pacific and the European theater together. And a victory of Russia in Ukraine is also a victory of China over the United States. So you cannot really separate the questions. You have to look into this together. And I'm advocating for this position. And I think others from Europe are advocating for this as well. It's not really helpful that there is this tendency to look into this like those were entirely separate matters.
I mean, I hear what you're saying, but I feel like what you hear on the Republican side is that actually we have overestimated the lessons that China is learning from the war in Ukraine. And actually, Europe can't really do much in the Indo-Pacific. It has to focus on being able to get its own continental security right. And there's this sense that, foreign policy prioritization, while not a new idea, has sort of been co-opted by the Trumpist wing of the Republican Party as though they're the only ones that are saying this. Do you think that the China aspect of this has been overblown a little bit? Do you actually think that China is looking at what's happening in Ukraine and taking lessons learned from Taiwan on it? Or I know that this we hear
China
this, but
is carefully looking what's going on in Ukraine. China is collecting data on the war fighting, but also on the reactions. China, I think it's clear to me, and as we speak, just yesterday, Minister Kuleba had an extensive visit to Beijing and conversations there. It seems to me China wants to be part of a solution, if there is any, to increase its footprint in Europe. So there is a Chinese aspect in all of this. And of course, China with dual-use goods and with other goods is supporting the Russian war machine. There are many aspects, I think, where the US is right. I think the Europeans cannot have the cake and eat it. If the Europeans are supporting Ukraine with one hand and with the other hand, they are not sanctioning China for delivering dual-use goods to Russia, this is not the basis of a successful strategy. But on the other hand, this strict separation of Europe on the one side and Indo-Pacific on the other side, I think is also not the most helpful perspective. And let's not forget one thing. The war is not won yet. So I think for the future of the European security architecture, but also for the future of all our relations to China, the significant question is who is winning the war in Ukraine? So we better win it. I think that will be the best message also to the Chinese.
Well, you said at the Atlantic Council a couple of weeks ago that you feel like we're just sort of slowly losing.
That's one aspect also with the US elections. It's from the Ukrainian point of view, everybody is thankful for the Biden administration building this strong transatlantic alliance, supporting Ukraine, leading the way in military assistance. At the same time, this incremental approach of military assistance, driven very much by fears of escalation and by trying to measure things, is a recipe for a long war at the cost of the Ukrainians. I think we understand that now. And if there is not the military assistance to bring Ukraine into a position that it can decisively beat Russia on the territory of Ukraine, and at the same time a strategic perspective for long-term security guarantees, I'm afraid then we are slowly losing, because Putin will continue for years and years taking village by village in Ukraine.
I want to ask about Germany specifically, actually, because the vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, has said things and tweeted that, stuff like Germany's defense policies have developed into manure. Like, that was an actual term he used. He said that they're lacking in defense and security in pursuit of dumb energy policies. I think this is another line that he might have tweeted. But Germany, Germany's reaching the 2% right now, but it's because in part of this $100 billion special fund that Olaf Scholz announced in 2022. And that's going to run out. And it will run out if Trump wins in November. It will run out when Trump is in office, which means that Germany will fall, I think, back below the 2% of GDP, which is going to be a huge problem. How did you have any specific conversations on the ground at the RNC that gave you a sense of how the Republicans are thinking about the U.S. relationship with Germany specifically? And is that going to be on the chopping block? Because it sort of was during Trump's first time in office.
Yeah, I would prefer if the German government would have been able to raise the regular defense budget without the special fund to a level that it permanently gives 2% of the GDP to defense. And it's a mistake by the German government and by the German parliament not to push the budget into that direction. It makes the argument, I think, with any US government very weak. It always gives people who want to attack Germany a legitimate target for attacks. as in the attacks you mentioned. And I think Germany has to close this gap. There is no way around it, and there's also no way in dragging it out. But of course, the current German government is very much infighting over the budget, and it seems to be very difficult to really proceed with the Zeitenwende. So it's a Zeitenwende only for parts of the government. Others still seem to hope that they can return to something that was there before. And there is a very unhealthy discussion in Germany, always playing social payouts against defense budgets, which I think is the totally wrong way to go about it. But that's part of the German elements of populist political discourse. I think the Germans would be easier in handling any US government if there, at least in the midterm financial planning, there would be a clear path towards the 2%. And if it comes to capabilities, to burden sharing on Ukraine, to burden sharing on the eastern flank, like with the brigade in Lithuania, there would be concrete measures that would strengthen the argument that Germany is more ready now to take care of its own security needs. But let's be honest, it's not only Germany. I mean, if you look at support for Ukraine, Germany is performing much better now. But what about Italy? What about France? What about Spain? What about the big European industrial nations? I think they are by far not where they should be when it comes to support of Ukraine.
Okay. Well, this was super interesting. I have one final question. I know I think I said the last question would be the last one, but we've sort of, it feels like in Europe, or Europeans have sort of gotten into this dynamic where they are hopeful that a Democrat will be elected because Democrats in the last few election cycles have been much more, America is back as the message, and much more pro-alliance, pro-global partnerships. They've gone a little bit easier on Europe, and it seems like there's this sense of nervousness for a potential Trump presidency because of the harshness of the rhetoric last time around and how Europeans maybe aren't prepared for that. Do you think that we've gotten into that dynamic, and how do we get ourselves out of it? Does it just mean, look, Europeans need to shoulder more of the burden and they need to spend more? Is that a simple calculation?
It will be more difficult to attack the Europeans if they do their homework. But transatlantic relationship is nothing where the Europeans have to beg for something from the United States. I think a strong transatlantic partnership is very much in the interest of the United States of America. And that is an argument that also should be made in this discussion. If you see the military operations that are run through Europe over the last decades, it's all of them. If you see the footprint the United States have in their own interest in Europe and around Europe, so there is a discussion to be had about the US interest in this. It's not just a transactional relationship. But I think the task for the Germans and the Europeans is not to advocate for one or another candidate in this campaign. We are not voting. I think the task for the Germans and for the Europeans is to provide more for their own security and to prepare for any possibility, and then to pursue our interest, which is a strong transatlantic security relationship. I think that is what we learned from 2016, where I think large parts of the European establishment have been very one-sided and later found it very difficult to build relationships. So let's do our homework. The Americans have to make the decision whom they want to vote for, and then it's our interest to work with whoever is president.
That's a good message. Nico, thanks so much for taking time out of your schedule to be with us. And I'm sure we'll have more of these conversations as maybe we get closer to the election and in the aftermath of it. So enjoy your August, and thanks again.
If we have learned something in the last 2 weeks, it will not be boring.
Exactly. If nothing, this is what a year this week has been. Thanks so much.
Thank you.